All right, welcome back to part 2, overcultivation. So this means you're growing crops too intensely on the land. You're not giving time for the nutrients to renew themselves. So one way to prevent this is to do what's called crop rotation, meaning alternating the crop planted. Example, corn one season, soybeans the next. This can restore nutrients to the soil and fight pests and disease. Let's think about the logic of that. If you're a pest and you eat corn, well, the next year, if they decide to plant soybeans instead, you don't have your food source, so your population is going to die off. And similarly with fungal and other diseases, things like that. You can also do intercropping, mixing crops. So like we saw in the last image a few slides back, now you have different plants, and each of these plants is going to use a different level of nutrients or different mix of nutrients from the soil. So, and some of these crops are going to actually add nutrients to the soil if they are legume plants, which are bean plants. And we'll learn about that more in our next unit. And so we saw this at Fairview Gardens. And so this is a good time to introduce the idea of a limiting nutrient. It's the one nutrient of all the ones that a plant needs that is lowest in relation to how much the plant needs. Therefore, it is the one limiting the plant's growth. This concept also applies to algae or any organism for that matter. So for example, if the limiting nutrient in the soil is, say, phosphorus, you can add as much nitrogen to the soil as you want, and you will not increase crop yield, not even a little bit. If you add more and more phosphorus, then yields will increase until you reach a point at which some other nutrient is now the limiting nutrient. Perhaps nitrogen becomes the limiting nutrient at that point. So here's an analogy. It's called Liebig's barrel. So just as the capacity of a barrel with staves of unequal length is limited by the shortest stave, so a plant's growth is limited by the nutrient in shortest supply. And stave means the wood board that forms the barrel. So here we can see that the water is going to only go as high as the lowest one. And so imagine these are nutrients in the soil: nitrogen, potassium, phosphorus, carbon. Then it doesn't matter how much potassium or how much phosphorus is in the soil. If the nitrogen is too low compared to what the plant needs, then it's not going to grow any faster, even with the addition of these other ones. So if you add more nitrogen to the soil, as soon as the nitrogen gets above the level of the phosphorus, then the phosphorus becomes the limiting nutrient. And when I say above the level, I don't mean an actual like percentage. I mean compared to what the plant needs. At some point here, the plant might say, okay, I have enough nitrogen now. What I really need at this point is more phosphorus so that I can grow faster. And this leads to the idea of over-fertilizing, because fertilizers supply these nutrients, especially nitrogen and phosphorus, to soil. Inorganic fertilizers are mined or synthetically manufactured mineral supplements, and they're synthetically manufactured usually from fossil fuels, compared to organic fertilizers, which include animal manure or crop residues, compost, etc. Organic fertilizers are better because they improve soil structure, nutrient retention, and water retention. By soil structure, we mean that they contain microorganisms of themselves, which help to keep the soil intact. And nutrient retention, because these organic fertilizers contain a lot of organic matter, like manure or like decomposing matter, they're going to be providing nutrients. And because a lot of that decomposing stuff is kind of wet and spongy, it also helps the soil to retain water. So let's look at this graph. It's showing nitrogen inputs from fertilizer in red compared to nitrogen inputs from legumes and pasture. Legumes meaning growing bean plants. Like the natives are well known to have the three sisters. We plant squash, corn, and beans all together, and the bean plants provide nitrogen to the soil for the corn and the squash. And then in the same way, the squash there would be providing erosion control from winds and also heavy rains. And the corn provides a structure for the beans to grow up around. So, brilliant. Animal manure is also added to soil to provide fertilizer. Manure is super high in nitrogen. And so, which of these is true? A, B, C, or D? This is just an exercise in reading the graph. Go ahead and hit pause and see if you can figure out the correct answer. A little graph practice. Okay, welcome back. So if you said that it became the primary nitrogen source in the 1960s, that's true. That's where it began to exceed these other two colors. And this is huge because we generally say that without the development of synthetic fertilizers, which occurred in the early 1900s, we would only have about 2 billion people on the planet instead of 7 billion, because that greatly increased our ability to grow food. So we can see here that since the early 1900s compared to the late 1900s, we've seen sometimes a 3 or maybe 4-fold increase in the nitrogen levels in rivers in this country. And that is because of runoff. And runoff meaning that you are applying these fertilizers to your field, but it's running off with your irrigation water or rainwater into the nearest waterways. This can lead to eutrophication. Now, eu means good. That's what it means as a root word. And trophication means nutrient. So this is where you have excess nutrient enrichment in the water, which increases production of organic matter. By organic matter, you should think of plants and algae growing very fast because they have now excess nutrients. Now, when these algae and plants decompose, they are being decomposed by or eaten by oxygen-using microbes, which can deplete water of oxygen, creating a condition that we call hypoxia. So eutrophication is really too much of a good thing. It's too much fertilizer going into a waterway. And here's a little graphic, and we're going to see this again in our next unit. You have the Mississippi River coming in, carrying a bunch of nitrogen runoff from all the fields in the central Great Plains. So these nitrates make the phytoplankton. Remember, phyto is the photosynthesizing plankton, the algae. It's making them flourish at the surface because just like plants, they love that nitrogen. And they grow too fast, they end up dying, they sink to the bottom, and now the decomposer microorganisms, they go crazy because there's so much food for them. So as they're decomposing the organic matter, they are using up oxygen, and that's creating a drop in the oxygen level in the water, and the fish need that. Without the oxygen, they're going to begin to die off. And this happens every year when we get the big rains coming in, and it brings this water from the great Mississippi watershed and makes the Gulf of Mexico experience a dead zone where all the fish in that area die. And we'll take a closer look at that in our next unit. All right. So I'll just point out one thing here. You have still a lot of oxygen along the top surface here because as these phytoplankton are doing their photosynthesis, they are putting oxygen into the water. But down here, you get excessive decomposition happening, and that's using up the oxygen, creating this hypoxic. And hypo is the opposite of hyper. If it were a hyper, whatever would it be? Hyper? Anyways, hypo means too little oxygen. Okay, and here's just a graphic showing the idea of fertilizer runoff. So you're applying fertilizer in your field, and then some of that is infiltrating into the ground and getting into your groundwater, contaminating it. Some of it's running off into your local waterways, causing eutrophication. We can see all the algae growing there. And some of it's evaporating, creating nitrogen oxides in the air, which are contributing to air pollution. They can contribute to smog and also acid rain. So let's take a look at overgrazing and deforestation. Overgrazing is when livestock eat too much plant cover on rangelands, impeding plant regrowth. It's a case of a grazing species exceeding its carrying capacity. And here we see the contrast between ungrazed on the left and overgrazed on the right of a fence line. And notice that there's less grass and more weeds on the right. The grass is the natives. Over here, because there's less grass, it's been overgrazed. And then you have the invasive species able to come in and spread. So this is an example of something we call a feedback loop. And I'll introduce it now. We're going to see it in our next unit as well. But here's how it goes. It's kind of a runaway effect. Overgrazing removes native grass, and that exposes bare topsoil, which can be susceptible to wind and water erosion. Now that you have erosion, you're going to have less native grasses, exposing more bare topsoil, causing more wind and water erosion, etc. Actually, I missed one part of that. Wind and water erosion causing decreased grass growth and survival because now your soil has left. And so you also have another problem with overgrazing, which is that these animals are heavy and they compact the soil and damage the structure of the soil, which decreases the aeration that occurs in it. Oxygen cannot get in. It decreases the water that can infiltrate into the soil. And it also makes invasive species able to gain a foothold and outcompete natives in this altered environment. And these all have the effect of decreasing grass growth and survival, which means fewer native grasses, which means more bare topsoil, which means more erosion. So these contribute and get worse and worse because it's the grasses which are holding together that soil and preventing erosion. So how do you do responsible grazing? It can be done sustainably. Responsible ranchers maintain the productivity of their soil and grass. And here we see prescribed burns that can help clear out non-natives and return nutrients to the soil. So keep in mind with that usually non-natives don't do well in fire areas because they're not adapted to that area or those fire conditions. But it's the native plants who have roots that can survive fires and then they resprout afterwards. Deforestation is another big one. Here we see careless forestry practices that can also cause erosion and soil degradation. We are seeing here something called clear cutting, meaning cutting down all the trees. So when it rains, the water flows very fast down this hillside and brings with it soil. And the alternative to that is called selective cutting, where you're not cutting down every tree, you're leaving some adult mature trees, and those mature trees can reseed the area, and they also slow water flow. Let's talk a little bit about over-irrigation. Here we see irrigating fields. This is a very inefficient way to do it. A lot of this water is going to evaporate off. But this is the artificial provision of water to support agriculture. 70% of all fresh water used by humans is used for irrigation, especially here in California. Irrigated land globally covers more area than all of Mexico and Central America combined. This is not a natural thing to irrigate land. And irrigation has boosted productivity in many places, but too much can cause problems. And we're going to take a look at some of those problems. One is called waterlogging, which is over-irrigation that raises the water table so high that it suffocates plant roots. And by that, we literally mean that the roots are not getting the oxygen they need, or more specifically, the microorganisms on the roots are not getting the oxygen that they need. Salinization is another big problem. This is the buildup of salts in the surface soil layers, and it's a widespread problem. It's caused by evaporation in arid areas, meaning dry areas, which draws water up through the soil, bringing salts with it. And repeated irrigation causes repeated evaporation and more salts. So if you've ever done the dishes and you leave a dish to dry, and it might leave behind some kind of a milky white film, those would be minerals that were left behind by the water when it evaporated. And so we're going to actually do a little lab on soil salinization, but it's a tough thing to get rid of these salts. So how do you prevent it? Well, number one, you don't plant crops that need a lot of irrigation. Kind of makes sense. You irrigate with water that is low in salt content, if you can. You irrigate efficiently, using only as much water as necessary. And you use improved irrigation techniques. In conventional irrigation, only 43% of the water reaches the plants. The other portion is evaporating or running off. In drip irrigation, the water arrives in drips targeted to plant roots, conserving water, saving money, and reducing problems like salinization. How do you reverse salinization if it has occurred? You can wait for rain to flush away the salts. You can plant salt-tolerant plants. You can flush the soil with large quantities of less saline water, but this can lead to waterlogging. And so those are your options. Okay, there's a quick tour of some issues involving soil degradation. So we'll see you in class.